If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I would have guessed something with the letters I, P, and A. And I would have been wrong. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is here to stay. And Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain W04 Paramount can help brewers get the most out of their water fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, plus it's gluten-free. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle. And Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Learn more about this novel strain at imperialyeast.com and pick up your W04 Paramount before it's too late. People have been making beer and other alcoholic beverages for eons. In fact, there's evidence suggesting people were brewing barley-based beers as early as the 5th millennium BC. That is a long time ago, a point at which technology was very rudimentary at best, and scientific knowledge was, well, basically non-existent. As such, it's safe to say the beer being made back then was likely fermented by wild microbes in open vessels, out of which people consumed it directly, meaning it was most likely missing what I personally view as being the 5th crucial ingredient in beer. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this experience episode to talk about our experiences using various carbonation methods is contributor Andy Carter.
Yeah, so beer being carbonated is kind of in a weird space of beverages, because if you think about what you drink, if you have to drink water, like you basically have to drink water every day, that's not carbonated, and so many things aren't. It's not, while it's a natural process in the case of beer, it can be, it's kind of unnatural, right? It's not something you just go and, I should add carbon dioxide to this liquid. So, but at the same time, it's kind of magical in that way, because a beer that's otherwise bland tasting or kind of just okay, it wakens it up. It's like seasoning it, right? So I love carbonation, and I'm loving to talk about my experience. How do I carbonate beer and other beverages today? Absolutely.
You know, it really seems that brewers tend to focus on nearly every aspect of the brewing process more than they do carbonation.
Oh, yeah.
Though I genuinely believe it's deserving of a lot more love, and that's what we're going to be doing here. There are various ways, obviously, to impart beer with carbonation, and so that's what we're going to be focusing on in this episode. Now, just to be clear, we have talked about carbonation in a few past episodes, though all of them were focused on experiments that we've performed where we compared various carbonation methods. If you're wondering, those episodes are 736 and 176. Again, our purpose in this experience episode, as the name of this series implies, is to share our personal experiences using these various carbonation methods. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. Our guest for February of 2022 is research and development scientist from Yakima's John I. Haas, Julia Jennings, whose job includes doing a mix of fundamental research on hops and assisting in the development of awesome new hop products. Julia's been deemed the Hop Witch of Haas, which is a moniker she wears with pride. Whether you're a hophead or just someone interested in what goes on behind the scenes of one of the world's largest hop companies, this session is going to be a good one. Julia will be hanging out with patrons on February 26, 2022, so make sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more per month by Friday the 25th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. It's absolutely painless. You simply click the link, do your shopping, and we get a little kickback for the referral. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear such as the turnkey BH15 Pilot Brewing System, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Tony Martinez wrote in with feedback on episode 219, where we talked about our experiences speaking the language of brewing. That was our last experience episode. Tony said, "The term I see misused the most is yeast washing, when people really mean yeast rinsing. The difference being that washing involves the use of acid to drive the pH between 2.2 and 2.5 to eliminate bacteria."
Yeah. It's one thing. I've done a lot of different things in home brewing. I've never had to wash my yeast. I've considered doing it. I've read about it. Rinsing, washing. I mean, I think the main thing is there's the whole point of removing the bacteria, but to me, it's also like, are we really removing the bacteria? How careful are you doing it? If you're going to wash, you're going to also have to do some type of plating or something to make sure it's actually clean.
Yeah.
So I just stick to, I mean, it's a term that, I appreciate the distinction. It's one that I don't know of any home brewer that's doing the actual acid rinse, or acid wash in this case.
Yeah, I think Tony gives us a really good example that I'm surprised we failed to address in that episode.
Yeah.
I mean, I see this mistake made all the time. In fact, just last week, I believe it was, I got an email from someone asking for tips on washing yeast. And of course, in my head, I'm like, well, clearly they're just mistaking the terms, which is fine.
Yeah.
But it was really clear to me he meant rinsing, which if you haven't done yeast rinsing, that's basically, it's kind of a convoluted process wherein you pull off yeast from the fermentation, you shake it in some water, some distilled water in a, hopefully a sterile jar. It's what we were doing with pressure cookers and all this stuff. And it's kind of a pain in the butt, but all you're doing is rinsing, quote unquote, rinsing the trub out of it or trying to get as much trub and hot matter and such out of that yeast so that it's a clean pitch. We've done multiple experiments kind of demonstrating that you probably don't need to do that. You can just pitch yeast that you collect from your cake and it's not going to have any impact or minimal impact on the subsequent beer. But still, Tony, I agree with you. That is a oft misused term, the washing, rinsing distinction. If you are not using acid, if you're not plating it to make sure there's no bacteria in there, you're actually rinsing your yeast. You're not washing it. Yes. So, the guy who emailed me, I did not overtly tell him that he misused the term, but you better believe that when I replied, I used the proper terminology. So thanks for the feedback, Tony. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Of all of the annual brewing events I've attended, my absolute favorite, without question, is Hop Harvest up in Yakima, Washington. Sadly, because of COVID, I haven't been able to make it up there the last 2 years, and while I'm hopeful that changes this year, I was stoked to receive some wet hop beers brewed by listener Ryan Gregory, who lives in Prosser, a city right outside of Yakima. One of these beers was what Ryan calls C4 IPA, which is brewed with just heaps of fresh, undried Chinook, Centennial, Cashmere, and Comet hops.
1 minute beer review with Justin and Tim.
This looks a little dark. It's almost looks like apple juice.
Yeah, well, most beer kind of does. Well stated.
This smells like
this out of
a New Zealand wet hop, if that's such a thing.
Okay, it is.
Oh, that's good.
That's good too. Yeah, a little bitter.
There's a little bit of bitterness on there, but still super, super drinkable.
Yeah, it's very, very nice.
Yeah, this is a really good beer.
Yeah, it's actually a lot better, but it's good.
This is really good.
It's smooth and
a little bready.
All right.
I'm thinking maybe this is definitely an ale of some sort.
I think it's IPA.
It's an ale IPA. Is that a thing? I don't think that's a thing.
Sure, why not? It's good.
Yeah,
nothing crazy going on.
Yeah, this isn't some like chocolate habanero broccoli asparagus concoction.
I don't get any smell from it, but
not much aroma coming off of it, which I don't think is really a bad thing because the flavor back end.
Yeah, it's got good flavor. That bitterness for me is a little too much. I just don't like that kind of taste.
I think this is pretty darn good. What are you thinking?
I'll go with a 6.
A 6?
Yeah.
I'm going to give this an 8.
When I first heard of wet hop beers, I was skeptical, but after having so many over the last few years, I am a fan. Ryan C4 was an excellent example of what can be done with fresh, wet hops. All of the nice fruity and piney C-hop characteristics with this really pleasant, I guess I would call it green, but not grassy note that I think really fills in the gaps in a beer like this. In my experience, they also tend to be a little bit maltier, which Ryan's was, but not overpoweringly so. Really another great wet hop beer, Ryan.
How did these guys know it? They called it, cold shotted it like 10 seconds in, wet hop beer. Like, I don't think I have the ability to just know a beer is wet hopped.
They were, honestly, if you throw 15 darts at a dartboard, one's bound to hit. That's all that was.
That's what it was. That was good. Very impressive. Beer sounded great. I think that's the one thing so it's like kind of brewing with regionality. By living up there and being close to the farm, as a home brewer, you can literally get wet hops, right? I don't know how much I would be spending to get wet hops, right? Mailed to California, right? So super cool. Great use of like local local ingredients in this case, and it sounded like a killer beer. So
Yeah, and that's one of the things when using wet hops is that they'll spoil very quickly. And
Yes,
so
yeah.
I know that there are some folks who are shipping wet hops immediately after they're picked. They're keeping them cold. They're going through all this, and it's not cheap. So one way to make wet hop beers, if you're really interested, is grow yourself a couple of binds. And I know, I believe Yakima Valley Hops right now is selling rhizomes. Hops are not a terribly difficult plant to grow. I know that Jake, from Brewlosophy, he makes a wet hop beer annually with hops that he grows up in Denver, Colorado. So it's absolutely something you can do on your own. And I think it's kind of a really neat way, or kind of a neat excuse, I guess, to use for growing your own hops, is that you can make your annual wet hop beer, make it a tradition or something like that. So Ryan, again, I appreciate you sending that beer in. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in reviewed by Justin and Tim, email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. Time for a quick break. When we return, we will be discussing our experiences with various carbonation methods. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the exGEERitor Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the exGEERitor Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every exGEERitor comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exGEERitor.com today.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. There's no denying that carbonation in one form or another has always existed, even in the beverages being made by our earliest ancestors. If it was fermented, chances are some of it was at least marginally more bubbly than water. However, it wasn't until modern humans had a better grasp of what carbonation actually is that we began controlling it in the beverages that we make. Now, before we start digging into the various methods for carbonating liquids, beer, cider, wine, perhaps we can spend a minute going over some basics of what carbonation actually is.
Yeah. So, I think we've all experienced this. We're drinking beer. We understand beer. We know that it has bubbles, and that bubbles is literally dissolved carbon dioxide. So water, beer is mostly water, some alcohol, some other stuff. So 90 to 95% water, and water can absorb gases, and it can actually absorb carbon dioxide incredibly efficiently. And as you may have, figured out over the course of brewing, it also takes it on when it's cold. It takes it on incredibly efficiently. It becomes super saturated with carbon dioxide. So this gives it that bubbliness, that effervescence. Since it's technically, when it's dissolved, it breaks apart into different molecules and it can become somewhat acidic. That's why it has a kind of a tanginess to it, or perceptible feeling of acidity on the palate. So the literally, if you measured the pH with dissolved carbon dioxide, it'd be a little more acidic. when it's open to the air, it's obviously want to come out because what every liquid wants to do is equilibrate with whatever environment's in. So once it's out of a sealed vessel, so if you've carbonated something, you open it up and it fizzes, and then over time the carbon dioxide will evaporate out and it'll become whatever amount of carbon dioxide is trying to equilibrate with the environment in it. So the atmosphere has carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, right? So it's going to equilibrate. Now it can stay kind of entrained in the liquid until it's disturbed, right? So if you ever, a watched pot never boils, right? But if you boil water in a very clean vessel, it won't nucleate immediately, right? It'll actually go over 212 or 100 degrees C, 212 Fahrenheit, 100 degrees C, and then it will start to boil at some point, right? And then it's actually going to explode. So it needs nucleation, and that's why actually when you have a barrel aged beer, it can actually have lower dissolved carbon dioxide in it because it's actually kind of agitated by the wood.
Huh. Interesting.
So carbon dioxide is very interesting about how carbon dioxide gets into liquids and out of liquids, but this is kind of the basics of what gases in liquids. Really, it's actually quite a cool chemistry and physics problem. So
yeah, and we're not going to go too far down that rabbit hole. Just to know that carbonation in general. I mean, you all know what carbonation is. It's the bubbly sensation that you get on your tongue because of carbon dioxide being saturated into the liquid, whatever liquid it is you're putting in your mouth. Now, there are some things in the brewing industry, at least in the U.S., carbonation is measured in volumes. We're not going to be talking about how to get proper volumes. Everybody has access to different calculators and charts. But 1 volume of CO2 would indicate 1 liter of CO2 in 1 liter of liquid. So it's a pretty simple measurement and way of measuring the amount of carbonation, or, saying how much you like in a beer. And beer is typically carbonated anywhere from between about 2 volumes. That would be kind of like your classic English ale. It can be a little bit lower. I know barley wine, I believe they say, can be around 1.7 volumes. Again, that's you're basically drinking something that just barely bubbles in your mouth, and in my opinion really does add that carbonic bite that is necessary. I mean, people who complain about carbonic bite, I usually think are probably misperceiving it for something else, but it just adds that necessary little nip to make that beer pleasurable. It's what makes the beer beery, in my opinion. And you can get all the way up to around 4 volumes of CO2 as well, and that might be something like a German Weiss beer. I know that some Belgian styles are known for being quite sparkly as well.
Correct. Yeah, I would say the best example is a Duvel, a Belgian Golden Strong. I mean, we're talking 4 to 5 volumes. We're talking basically champagne level carbonation.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the average for beer, again, champagne, you're looking around 4 volumes, 4.5 volumes, right? I think sparkling wines that don't quite reach that champagne level, you're looking at about 4 volumes. Beer, you're looking at like 2.5 volumes being right around average for most styles, most American styles. I've never actually measured the carbonation in my beers, but I tend to prefer subjectively slightly more bubbly, and for various reasons. My main thing is I don't want the beer going flat, and so the way I look at it is if I can put a little bit more carb into it while it's in the keg, serve a nice fizzy beer as it comes out, as that beer warms over the 6 or 7 minutes I'm drinking the pint, it's still going to have bubbles when you get to the bottom, and I like that. Some people love to just bag on others for whatever stupid reason they can come up with, and one of those, at least it used to be, was, oh, you made an ESB and it's carbonated over 2 volumes. You must not know, beer very well. No, you can do whatever the hell you want. That's the beauty of this hobby. So again, we're looking at around 2.5 volumes is about standard for most styles. Now, there are 2 main the way I look at it is like 2 main approaches to mother approaches to carbonating beer. You've all heard the terms, and we're going to focus on natural carbonation methods here in this segment, and we'll move into forced carbonation later. But there are quite a few under that umbrella of natural carbonation methods. There are quite a few kind of sub methods for carbonating whatever beverage it is you want bubbles in. Now, when we talk about natural carbonation methods, what exactly is it we're referring to?
So by natural, I mean yeast is going to produce the CO2. So if we ferment a beer, you have an airlock, and an airlock, that's yeast fermenting, taking sugar, making alcohol, but a lot of CO2. The main byproduct is actually CO2. Kind of interesting, right? I would say there's probably, selective or evolutionary pressure for beer to have carbonation because it's already naturally in the beer when it's finished fermenting, right? So
it was meant to be as well.
It was meant to be. It was meant to be, right? So yeast metabolize sugars, and you can be, so if we, when you do a calculator, you can go download these sugar calculators, right? How much dextrose or how much corn sugar to how much beer gives you this many volumes of CO2. Easy peasy, right? Those calculators assume some level of CO2 in the beer already, right? So you just remember that when we talk about bottle conditioning in a little bit, there's just kind of estimates as how much CO2 is in it still. But once you add that sugar, maybe add more yeast depending on the fermentation. If it's a fresh beer, I would say 2 or 3 weeks, I would not add more yeast. It's plenty of yeast is still in solution. Now, if it's an older beer or a bigger beer, you may need to add more yeast, at a little small charge of yeast at bottling. But you'll add sugar, mix it up really well, and then cap it. And now that you have a sealed vessel, a second fermentation will occur, and that will literally saturate the beer with CO2.
Yeah, the CO2 that's being, I kind of use, I suppose some people might view these terms as being somewhat crass, but I was taught this by the shop that I bought my original kit from. They said, yeah, yeast is really simple. It pisses out alcohol and it farts out CO2. And that's what exactly the two things that you need to make your beer. So it's kind of like, hey, we're repurposing your byproducts. It's pretty exactly. Ergonomical or economical, if you ask me. But yeah, so all natural carbonation methods do rely on the same principles, namely that CO2 is produced, quote, naturally by the yeast fermenting sugars in a sealed vessel to encourage that saturation in the liquid, whether it's beer, wine, cider, mead, or whatever else. We are going to be using the term beer mostly, but this applies for all types of fermented beverages. So the first and perhaps most common approach to natural carbonation, the method that is used probably by like 90 to 95% of most homebrewers brewing their first batch, is of course bottle conditioning, which all bottle conditioning is you put a small amount of priming sugar, a relatively small in my opinion, priming sugar in your already fermented beer, right? We all know how to do this. Some people have figured out different ways of adding the priming sugar to avoid cold side oxidation. Some people I know use kegs when they bottle condition. I think that's kind of a genius approach. But anyways, you're adding a little dose of extra sugar because ostensibly the sugar that is already in the beer has been fermented out. So you add back that sugar. It can be dextrose, sucrose, honey, turbinado, whatever it is you want. And then you seal that. Then you rack that fermented beer with that priming sugar into bottles. You cap it off and you let them sit warm for a while. I think most people say room temperature. So you're looking at 68 F, 20 C, give or take 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 or 2 degrees C, and you leave it for about 2 to 3 weeks, and you got carbonated beer. And so that is the basics of bottle conditioning. To get into our experiences with this, I always hated the bottle conditioning process, only because in my experience, it took so much time. And it was like the very last thing, it's the very last part of your process. The beer is sitting there in the fermentation vessel. It's ready to be drank. It just needs that fizz. And now you're bottling it and you got to wait basically double the amount of time that you did waiting for that beer to ferment out. And for me also, I always thought the bottle conditioning was kind of messy. I'm not a big mess guy. I like to clean stuff up. And you're getting drips all on your floor and it's sticky. And if you miss a spot, you get yelled at by your wife, stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of psychological experience here. So for you for brewing. But I think the big thing for me is it's the first technique. I think it's important in the historical sense. Your first homebrew kit, your brown ale, you're going to bottle condition it. You're going to wait. Now, I mean, today, that was 10 years ago, right? When I first started doing this, right? That's how it worked. Now, kegging obviously is the more modern technique. For me, if I'm doing this these days when it needs the level of carbon dioxide I can otherwise not achieve from kegging, right? When it's impractical, this is when I'm bottle conditioning. So usually when you're doing that, my understanding for people who go that route is like with Saison or like you mentioned earlier, like a Belgian triple or something like that. Yeah. Are you also using thicker bottles? Because my understanding is the standard, amber glass bottles that you can buy at your homebrew shop will only hold up to like 3.5, safely at least, like 3.5 volumes before they start popping. And so if you're going for a triple, are you getting those like super thick Belgian style glass or glass bottles as well? Or and I wouldn't say my first reaction to so subjectively, if you're just going to say, hey, I should use thicker glass because someone said that, well, I'm going to be honest, sometimes I do that, right? It's just that. The other reason is that the presentation matters, right? If I'm going to brew, let's say I'm going to do 50 batches a year, one of them's going to be a Belgian Golden Strong or something like that. I'm going to go all out and make it nice, right? And then just because I'm going to make it nice, I'm going to use cork and cage. It's going to be thicker glasses by nature. I would say glass bottles are especially if they're fresh, you just bought them, they're not reused, they're not rinsed. I bet they could take 4 or 5 volumes, but you're pushing the limits of the manufacturing process, right? I have only, knock on wood, I've only lost a couple bottles to explosions. What's interesting though is, what do you think popped? Do you think the lid popped, or do you think the bottom fell out?
I would think that the lid would pop off.
The bottoms fell out. Literally, the seam where the seam between where the glass meets the bottom just popped.
So weird.
So weird, right? I would say, it's two things, right? It is a risk. I would say if you're just going to do it once in a while, then spring for the nice bottles. But I wouldn't be that concerned. I would just also maybe put that box, maybe put something underneath that box or something.
Yeah,
just to
exactly. Don't store it in your carpeted closet.
Exactly,
We've all heard those horror stories.
Exactly, those horror stories. Yeah. So,
oh my word.
In my experience, it's a good historical romantic technique of bottle conditioning, but I am not want to do it unless it's for the style that it needs to be.
Yeah, I don't do it ever. The process to me is really just monotonous and boring. Yeah. I mean, at least doing a full 5-gallon batch there. In the last decade, I'd say that I've probably bottled maybe a handful of times, 5 or 6 times. And usually it's like I've already filled my keg. There's a little bit of beer left over and I've got some carb drops. And carb drops are just little, they look like Hall's, throat lozenges. And you just drop one in your bottle and fill it with beer and then you cap it off. The thing with bottle conditioning, whether you're using priming sugar, in a bottling bucket or however you're dosing that sugar in your beer, is one, the parts that really drive me away from it, besides the monotony of it, is that you've got to be very, very careful with sanitation.
Yes.
If a bottle that has, if you want a bottle bomb, then you rack beer into that you've added more sugar to, right? You rack that into an infected or a contaminated bottle, right? A non-sanitary bottle, and that is it's a pain in the butt. You're doing that to 52 or so bottles. You have to figure out ways to do it. Now, I'm going to talk about some tips that I've actually used that other people gave me to make bottling a lot easier. I think the first one that I thought was just genius, actually the two big ones both involve a dishwasher, is one, if you have a dishwasher that has like a hot mode, run it clean one time so you don't get detergent and stuff on your bottles. Do like a quick rinse, empty of your dishwasher, and then you stack all your bottles in there. And especially if you have one of those dishwashers where it has one of those sprayers on the bottom of the top rack, you can fill both the top and bottom racks and just run a hot steam rinse type of thing. And it will sanitize your bottles. That has worked phenomenally well in the times that I've bottle conditioned. And then the other thing is, when you're done doing that, you just keep the bottles in those racks and you do all your bottling over the door of the dishwasher, and any spills are in the dishwasher. So you're not worrying about getting it all over the floor. When somebody told me that, I was like, how did I not think of this?
That's perfect. Yeah, I definitely, I've known that one too. I don't use it too much because I don't bottle too often. I definitely make a mess in the kitchen. It's part and parcel of my day. Usually brew days, honestly, I'm just cleaning the whole house. It's all gonna be a mess. I think the one I really like, I forgot who said this. I think I read it in like Homebrew Talk or something. And that's how I do all my bottling now is, you always get your bottling bucket, right? That's the thing comes in your first kit. Actually, what you should be doing is racking it into a keg. I know it sounds weird. Trust me. You rack it into a keg, but then you mix the sugar in the keg and then carbonate and then bottle off the keg. And that's because now you have another sanitary vessel that you can mix really well rather than using a bottling bucket. So, of course, if you already had a keg, why are you bottling out of a keg? But no, that's just a technique I heard from someone else. So,
well, a good response to your question there, Andy, is I think you can get a used keg. If you have a local friend who has kegs, honestly, just ask to borrow one and say, hey, when you need it back, just let me know. Now you've got a free bottling keg. Even though you're not serving out of that keg, you can put your priming sugar in there. You can rack your beer into a totally sealed stainless vessel that you can close, and then go buy yourself a $15 little CO2 gun and purge that of all oxygen. And then you can use that pressure to push the beer out of the keg into those bottles in a way less oxygen rich environment. And that is the biggest con that I have with bottle conditioning, is the oxygen exposure that is bound to happen when using a bottling bucket. But again, people are getting away with making absolutely fantastic plastic bottle conditioned beers. There's an argument to be made for that yeast remetabolizing any oxygen that's in that the beer does get exposed to in that brief time between, fermenter and bottle. So we're not dissing bottle conditioning, but using a keg is definitely a tip that I highly recommend. Now, speaking of kegs, there are other natural carbonation methods, bottle conditioning absolutely being the most popular. But one of them is what we refer to, and I think most people do, as keg conditioning. It is basically the same exact concept as bottle conditioning, but you've put the whole batch of beer into a keg with priming sugar, you seal it off, and then you place it in a warm place. Now you're doing a batch carbonation. So you're going to have a lot more consistency in obviously that whole beer is going to be carbonated at the same volumes. And it usually requires a little bit smaller of a sugar addition, which I think is interesting. I don't know why. And in my experience, I've done this a handful of times as well. It doesn't take nearly as long for that beer to get carbonated as bottles tend to. We're looking at, I think I made a batch one time, and after about 5 or 6 days, it was pretty much fully carbonated.
So I did dust off my notes from freshman chemistry to figure out the reason why there is less sugar needed. And there's a couple reasons, or at least there's a couple good theories. And I believe we talked about this during an experiment too. But there's two things that are different about bottles versus the keg. First, there's more headspace. Or there's definitely different amounts of headspace between 52 bottles and one keg.
Yeah.
Right. So when you carbonate, you have to fill that volume of CO2, fill that empty space full of pressure before beer is going to get carbonated, right? So there's carbon dioxide coming out of the beer, carbonating on the way up into the headspace, and then there's something called Henry's Law, which says there's an equilibrium of carbon dioxide in the headspace and in the beer, right? Eventually they come equilibrium. So you have to pressurize the top, and then it kind of starts carbonating too. So because there's more headspace, maybe needs more CO2 to fill the bottle headspace. The second thing is, because you're racking the beer, you're moving it, which is going to lose some carbon dioxide, versus 52 bottles versus one keg, which is you're not agitating the beer as much. So then you need less. So there's a couple reasons why it's less. Just keep it in mind. The nice thing about a keg is once you keg condition, if it's too carbonated, just degas it. You don't have to worry about it. Just remove the carbon dioxide. So
it's so much easier. Exactly. You're not going to explode a keg.
It'd be definitely not going to explode a keg.
It'd be almost impossible. And if you happen to put too much priming sugar and it's overcarbonated, literally all you do is give it a little shake to knock out some of that CO2, purge your keg, wait a couple of days, maybe 12 hours or so, purge it again until it's to your liking. And then you toss it in a fridge or rack it to bottles, however you want to do it. You can fill bottles with carbonated beer. We do it all the time. So that is the method that if I'm using natural conditioning, that's the method I'm going with, hands down, without question. Now, there are a couple other ones that I find really interesting. But before we move on to those, I do want to talk about this concern that people seem to have about fining bottle conditioned beers. If I gelatin fine it, or if I use Clarity Firm or something like that, is there going to be enough yeast in suspension to carbonate your beer? Yes. I know. I mean, unless you are letting that beer sit for 6 months or more, I wouldn't even worry about re-adding fresh yeast for carbonation purposes. My brother sent me some beers one time. So not only were these bottle conditioned, but he put them in the mail and sent them across from New York to California, and they were crystal clear. And he just followed my gelatin fining process that I gave him and bottled these beers off. There was very little amount of trub on the bottom of these bottles, which I always think is a sign of good process. Crystal clear, absolutely perfectly carbonated and delicious. And he fined them. So you don't have to worry about that. Do bottle conditioned or keg conditioned beers have to be hazy? Absolutely not. That is a big thing I used to see people complaining about when it came to natural carbonation is, you just have to accept that it's hazy beer. In fact, a bunch of old schoolers used to kind of hang their hats on the fact that, we have living beer. You also have stinky bedrooms is my guess. So I want to avoid that.
One of the most important or best examples of this is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Still bottle conditioned to this day. Do you see that beer being hazy? You pour that thing out, shake the bottom of it. It's not coming out. Those guys dialed in filtration, amounts of yeast. It's all dialed in, right? There is a slight little thin meniscus of haze right at the bottom of that bottle, but it's compact and staying down there, right? Yep. So that's how you do it. My experience in the keg conditioning is like you said, the main way I'm going to do bottle conditioning if I'm going to do it at all, right? But I think the most important tip or reference point is, say you're just like strapped for CO2 or you have not enough kegerator space. Get your kegs out, put the sugar in there and wait. And now you have essentially, you're just time delayed on pouring it, of course, but now you can carbonate like a bunch of kegs. Say you're having a big party and I just need to get the beer ready, but I have time. I don't have space, but I have time. Well, let them sit for 2 weeks, throw them in the kegerator or throw them in the picnic taps outside for the party, and you're good to go, right?
Exactly.
So it kind of allows you to multiply your beer serving experience without having to buy another kegerator.
Couldn't agree more with that. There now the next two natural conditioning methods we're going to talk about I find really interesting. I've only ever used this next one, which is called spunding. One time, I actually built my own spunding valves. All spunding is you basically take a pressure relief valve and attach it to your fermenter throughout fermentation. Most people who I know who are using spunding to carbonate their beers are attaching their valve to the fermentation vessel. Now that means you have to have a fermentation vessel that allows for the attachment of a spunding valve, and there are various ways you can do that. But you attach it on and you'll set it to, I think it's pretty typical to do about 15 psi. And that way what it's doing is the pressure in that fermentation vessel, whether you're using a keg or an attached something like I know the Delta Firm Tank has you can get a ball lock attachment so that you can do pressurized fermentations like this. Now, it won't hold 15 psi, so you got to be careful with that.
Yeah.
I think most people who are doing spunding are fermenting in their in a keg, or they're racking the fermenting beer to a keg and then adding the spunding valve. But you set it to about 15 psi, which means that vessel will always have 15 pounds of pressure on it, and it's all CO2 that is naturally produced by the yeast. And then anything over that gets pushed out, right? It gets let out of that PRV on the spunding valve. And all a spunding valve is just this. It's kind of a line of components put together so that that allows you to attach a PRV to your keg or your fermentation vessel. That's all it is.
Yeah. And this is something, I really only ferment in PET carboys or the Delta Firm Tanks. And like you said, they'll take a few PSI, just enough to keep everything sealed up, but they won't really pressurize. These are the higher end, they're more professional looking or prosumer gear that you can buy today. A fantastic number of people sell this stuff, and it's amazing that we can buy it in the volumes, 5 to 10 to 15 gallons, right? So this is great if you have that gear, and then you get this, I would say it's a little more, of course, natural process. This is very traditional in German style brewing to do a spunding, right? And hey, you're buying less CO2, so it's really just saving you money. Like I said, I don't typically do this just because I don't have the gear for it. I have friends that swear by this. Yep. It's a cool technique, and like I said, it's really, these are the days that we have access to equipment that can do this. So, arguably, people will say this is a different type of carbonation, or it's going to be different. But and then for me, this is just another technique if you have the equipment.
The major pro to spunding, in my opinion, is that your beer literally never touches oxygen until you serve it.
That's just true.
From the point of pitching your yeast to the point that beer is going into the glass, and usually this is a method where people will serve from the fermentation vessel, which is why if you have 5 gallon corny kegs, you may as well just scale down your recipe to 4.5 gallons or so, as opposed to 5.5, like I think a lot of people typically do. And now it'll all fit in that keg. You put a spunding valve on it, and then the beautiful thing is, if you cut off the bottom half or 1 inch or so of your liquid dip tube, it's still going to suck out a bunch of the trube. So you will eventually get nice clear beer. There'll just be some trube down at the bottom of your keg when you're done drinking it. It's a really, really neat way to completely eliminate the risk of cold side oxidation while not having to pay for CO2, at least for these purposes, right? For forced carbonation, or putting sugar in there and risking cold side oxidation yet again. I mean, it's an awesome method. I built out a spunding valve just because I wanted to build something. It honestly costs like $35. I mean, if you go onto Amazon, you can find different builds online. I think we have one up on brewlosophy.com. You can go to Amazon.com and pick up all the parts you need, have it shipped to your house in a couple of days, and you're set. You just put the thing together and you can use it. It's so easy. It sounds confusing because of the name, but it really is quite easy.
So for the Delta Firm Tanks, because I wanted to get out of having the that Erlenmeyer flask full of Star San or whatever for blow off, I bought from Kegland. They have a fully finished, I think it's like maybe $20. It's a valve and it's a dial, and you can actually have the dial be different grades, right? It can go to different levels of PSI.
Oh, yeah.
And it just in line with the Kegland and the EVA barrier, John Guest type fittings, right? So it locks it in, and it's good to go. So I have dry air locks on my keg, or my fermenters, right? I love it. And it's the same thing as a spunding valve. It's perfect.
I've seen those photos, and I've been meaning to ask you what the hell those things are. I had no idea that's what they were. Yeah, that's super cool.
Highly recommend. They're super functional.
Yeah, cool. Well, another somewhat similar approach, and this is the reason I saved this one for last is because it's also kind of arguably somewhat risky. What people refer to as capping the fermenter. All that means is in your fermentation vessel, again, I would recommend using the vessel you plan to serve the beer from. Towards the end of fermentation, you just cap it off. You close that vessel, which would mean if you are using a keg, you take off your blow-off tube and you let those last 4 SG points, 1 to 2 degrees Plato, you let that be what carbonates the beer. Now, if you're doing it in a keg and you overcarbonate, again, who cares? It's easy to fix. But if you're doing it in a fermentation vessel that can only hold up to 10 psi or something, there's a chance you're going to get some sort of a deformation of your lid. I don't know how I know that, but capping the fermenter is definitely a valid way to naturally carbonate your beer. You just gotta. It's one of those things that I've never. I tried it one time and I deformed my lid. The people who I know who are successful at using this method, what they've said is they had to do it like 5 or 6 times to really dial in and know when they're going to go and cap the fermenter. And usually what that means is they're taking daily, like 2 or 3 days into fermentation, they're taking daily SG readings to make sure how, what their predicted FG is, and they want to be about 4 to 5 points higher than that when they cap it so that they don't overcarbonate the beer.
I mean, this is very similar to spunding, right? It's just the more like, dialed in, like you said, the people that do this have experience. They know this beer needs 4 points left to then seal off and then go for it. The guys that I know that spunned, same exact thing, right? Okay, I'm going to spun now because I got this many points left. I can do it here. And for me, like I said, I don't have the gear for it. I do have the unfortunate experience of a beer, doing it to locking up its own self by clogging the airlock, and then I ended up with beer on the roof or the ceiling of a garage I lived in. So
the old Vesuvius brew.
Yeah, exactly. So, I like we said, this is I would say spunding and capping are more advanced techniques. And if you're worried, I would just stick with spunding. But some people, it's like, hey, this works for me. This is what I know. I'm so dialed in on this beer that I'm good to go for capping. So
exactly. And with both spunding and capping, things that I've read and heard from people who use either of those methods is that oftentimes there's also a concern that you're going to undercarbonate the beer. Sure. Most people who are using this method also have a kegging setup where they serve from taps. All you're going to do is put gas on there and wait until it reaches your desired carbonation level anyways. Yeah. Now, you kind of mentioned something with spunding that some people do, and that is adding the spunding valve at a certain point in fermentation.
Yes.
The nice thing about spunding is that you could, ostensibly you could use the spunding valve from the beginning of fermentation. Some people are concerned with doing that because of the toxicity of CO2 and yeast. There's some concern that, maybe it's going to, halt the yeast from fully attenuating and doing its job. In the few times I've used a spunding valve, I've not had any issues with that. I think if you're brewing, moderate OG beers, 1050 to 1060 or so, you're safe. Anything higher than that, you probably do want to do whatever you can to favor that yeast and to give them the best opportunity to do their work. And so maybe you want to put the spunding valve on a little bit later. Now, without a doubt, natural carbonation methods are a legit way to impart beer with one's desired level of sparkle. And barring leaky vessels or dead yeast, they tend to work without fail. Of course, there are some drawbacks, though. For example, the process may increase the risk of cold side oxidation, as we discussed, and it does tend to require a bit more time, at least when bottle or keg conditioning. When we come back from this break, we'll be focusing on arguably more modern methods of forced carbonation. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. To this day, every time I add the first kettle hop addition to a batch of boiling wort, I nostalgically recall the very first batch I brewed, an Irish red ale. That experience of putting everything together to produce my very own beer is what motivated me to brew subsequent batches. However, it didn't take long for me to realize the one thing about brewing I absolutely hated: bottling. I've talked about it many times on this show. Not only was it time consuming and usually quite messy, but I also just hated waiting so long before I could dip into that first bottle, usually about 2 to 3 weeks, especially when I was living up in the Pacific Northwest, where it's, cooler than it is here in Fresno, California. I know people out there will disagree with me on this, and I'm okay with that. I fully accept that I am super impatient, and I truly mean it when I say that if it weren't for my move to kegging, I don't think I'd be brewing today. The ability to have beer ready the day after packaging, and not having a bunch of bottles everywhere in my garage in my house is really, really nice. Now, we discussed earlier the method of keg conditioning, which really is not very different than bottle conditioning. In this segment, we'll be shifting our focus to the various forced carbonation methods, which almost all rely on kegs as well.
So forced carbonating is exogenous CO2 or CO2 from an external source, right? So in this case, we actually learned this during the pandemic. A lot of CO2 comes from gas refining.
That's right.
Gasoline, oil refining. So there's a little bit of a burp there when that happens. So we had to, in the end, I don't think any home brewer saw this problem, but some breweries did not have CO2 for a little bit. But you get the CO2, you buy a big pressurized tank of it. That tank sits around 2,000 PSI. You add something called a regulator to that to regulate the gas down to serving pressure. So 10, 15, 20 PSI. And there you go. You got CO2. You put this on top of or you attach it to the keg, right? That puts a head pressure on the keg, like the 10 to 20 PSI. And then over time, that CO2 dissolves into the beer and then comes to equilibrium with the regulator. And there you go. You got carbon dioxide in your beer.
It is, it's simple, it works, and it's oh so beautiful. Now, there are various methods for forced carbonating beer, and this was actually what inspired us to first write about carbonation methods, was my own exploration into the various methods for forcing CO2 into beer using exogenous CO2 as opposed to, natural conditioning. And I've used all of these methods many times, so I actually feel very comfortable talking about my experiences on them, unlike things like like spunding, which I think I've done 3 times in my life.
Sure.
Now, again, just to point out, the overarching con to forced carbonation methods, I think, and it's a good one, is that it does cost a bit more money. You have to go out and invest in a CO2 tank. I'd say you could probably find used 5-pound CO2 tanks for anywhere between $30 and $60. And you have to buy CO2. You're looking at like average of maybe $15 to fill up a tank when it empties out. You have to buy a regulator. Again, you're looking at about $40 to $50. You have to get all the proper disconnects, all the tubing, and then you kind of have to understand how this whole process works. I cannot tell you how many times I've replied to emails from people saying, "Hey, I'm following this such and such method for carbonating my beer, and my beer's just not getting carbonated." And when I ask them, well, what'd you do? The number of people who have said, "Well, I put 30 psi on the keg, and it's not carbonating the beer." Well, did you remove the disconnect? Well, yeah, I took that off of there. No, you got to leave it attached. It's got to be a consistent flow of CO2 so that as that CO2 absorbs into the beer, there's more there. That's the whole point. Yeah. So just little things, understanding exactly how all of this stuff works. You don't have to be a mad scientist or anything like that. Perhaps the easiest and likely, I would contend, at least in the beginning of my kegging days, was the most popular approach, was what people refer to as the set it and forget it method.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is just, you've kegged the beer from the fermenter to the keg. You've attached the disconnects correctly. You've set the PSI correctly. The beer is starting to get cold. It's probably at room temperature or kegging temperature, so 50, 60 Fahrenheit. It's going to get down to 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And you just let it sit there. With all those attachments, as the beer drops in temperature, it'll start to absorb that CO2. It'll absorb it much more rapidly, of course, at lower temperatures. And then within, say, 7 to 14 days, it will be fully carbonated. Some people add fancy bubblers or attachments to maybe to their keg. I've seen this been done to entrain the CO2 more quickly, but I don't think you need to do that. This is the first way. I started homebrewing 10 or 11 years ago. Many bottlings with sugar. I think, when I started making hoppy beers specifically, I was like, I have to go to kegging. I know that this is the quote unquote better way to do it. And it is. I think it's objectively the right way to serve hoppier styles of beer. It's fresher. It's ready more quickly. And this is, I like we said, I think we're in agreement. This is really the only technique we use. Maybe there's other ways, of course, of adding the CO2 in different, how rapid you put the CO2 in, but this is generally the way to do it and my preferred way to do it.
Yeah. So I feel like you're talking about forced carbonation in general. In terms of the set it and forget it method specifically, the key here is that you're connecting the gas at serving pressure. So most people in their kegerators, I would think, at least on the home brewing scale, most people are in that 10 to 15 PSI, depending on how long their lines are and what inner diameter beer line they're using. 10 to 15 PSI for serving pressure. So with this one, you keg up the beer, you just attach your gas, and then you leave it alone for a week or two. I've done this so many times. This was how I started off, like I said, and I love it. It works. It works consistently well. My serving pressure started off at about 12 PSI, and I've since lengthened my line, and I'm now up to about 15 PSI because, again, I like more carbonated beers, or at least I like having the ability to carbonate my beers a bit more. So that's where I'm at now. And you can, like I said, you can just set the beer at that 14 to 15 PSI, leave it alone for a week or two, and it's carbonated. The nice thing is, in that time, that beer is continuing to, clear up because that colder environment is going to force those precipitates to fall out. Again, though, the big con for me on this, being impatient as I am, is that it does take time. You cannot, the next day, if you go out and you pull a pint of beer, it's not going to be carbonated, And you mentioned, that beer is going to be warm. So I actually always cold crash my beer. And so the beer is actually, perfectly cold and hopefully somewhat clear when I'm racking it to the keg. So I'm ready to drink this beer, but with set it and forget it, you got to wait a week or so before it actually has some bubbles in it.
I really like the fact of, you mentioned the conditioning aspect, because if you have a fermenter that isn't, so kind of what we talked about with pressurizable fermenters, you have the ability to really lock the fermenter down, which means you can get it cold without a leak happening, versus my stuff where if you get it cold, there's some question of how tight the seals are. So that's why I'm doing it warm. So I need that time in the keg actually to condition my beer a little bit more, which is why I prefer this method. So yeah,
and I know other Brewlosophy contributors prefer it as well. There is some people out there who have argued, I don't see it very often these days, but people out there who have argued that by using this method, you are going to reduce the risk of getting a quote unquote carbonic bite, which is that kind of tangy thing that some people perceive in carbonated beverages. I've never ever experienced it. I've experienced a bite, but usually my brain goes towards like something like that hop burn, yes. As opposed to carbonation causing it. So, but if you're concerned about that, set it and forget it is an absolutely legit way. You are almost assured that you are not going to overcarbonate that beer because you're not setting it at a high enough PSI to overcarbonate the beer, unless, of course, you're making like a low carbonation English ale and it just happens to be carbonated like an American ale. But again, that's an easy fix. So, and the nice thing is you're already at serving pressure, so you don't have to be mucking around with your regulator to change the PSI or anything if you're going to use this method. So again, it's a solid method that I know a lot of people are still using these days.
Yeah, if you're just starting out with kegging, I would just do it this way. We're going to talk about a couple other methods that are going to speed this up in a minute, but this is the tried and true way of doing it. So
absolutely. So I hated this method because it took too long and I'm an impatient jerk. So I remember hitting I built my first, I think I bought my first kegerator. God, must have been 13 years ago now, 12 or 13 years ago. And it was just a 2-tap thing that I found online, and got it here. And I was using the set it and forget it method. And I was like, man, I don't want to wait to drink these beers. I want to try them now. Right. And so I hit the web and I found a whole bunch of people talking about what has come to be referred to as the crank and shake method. And it is exactly what it sounds like. You connect your gas. First off, most people I know up the PSI that they put on the keg. So you keg up this beer, it's out of the kegerator or keezer, and you crank up the gas to 20 to 30 PSI or so. I know that there are some people out there who just use serving pressure, and I think you can get away with that. And then you basically shake your keg. And the idea being that it is going to significantly increase the beer's contact with CO2, which significantly decreases the carbonation time, or the time for that carbonation or that CO2 to saturate the beer. I've done this so many times. In my experience at 30 PSI, you're looking at 8 to 12 minutes of shaking, or I never shook it. I would roll it on my lap, and I had the bruises to prove it.
Yeah.
But because you're rolling a full keg on your lap and kind of move it around to keep it comfortable. And then you take it off, you purge the keg real quick to get the high pressure out of there. And you pop it in your kegerator and let it sit there for, I always recommend it overnight before you tap into it, because you want to let that CO2 kind of equilibrize, or however you say that, in the beer, so that you're not just getting foam. I mean, it's just like shaking up a can of beer or whatever. But it works. The biggest risk in my experience on this one is absolutely overcarbonation, because it's very hard to know when or how much carbonation is actually in that beer while you're shaking it like that.
Yeah. So like the main way people do it, just as a side, we've mentioned we don't have a measurement for this. We have basically lookup tables. So if you ever heard of anyone at Pro Brewing talk about something called Zom and Nagel, or get the Zom out. The Zom is a tool that is actually a calibrated CO2 meter. You actually literally fill the thing full of beer, seal it, and shake it to get all the CO2 out. And once you've shaken it long enough at the right temperature, it'll tell you how many volumes of CO2 are in it. So that's the Zom. Yeah. So they're pretty handy. They're very manual, right? It's a very barbaric way of doing it, of course. There's much more fancier ways. There's something called the C box, which will measure both dissolved oxygen and dissolved CO2, but those cost roughly 100 times more than the Zom and Nagel. So a very expensive, very fancy way of doing it. Anyways, the crank and shake, I definitely did this when I, like Marshall said, being impatient, I need the beer carbonated. For me, the bruises were not as much of an issue. I think the bigger or more riskier thing is know your CO2 system. If there is not a backflow checker on your CO2 system, I swear, you will put beer into your CO2 lines. Guaranteed. So just be very careful with this technique. It is a possibility you will have beer in places you don't want it, but it is a very effective technique too. So,
I've got so many funny stories with using the crank and shake method. Absolutely, you if you use this method at some point, there's a good chance you are going to get beer at least in your CO2 line. There's nothing very wrong with that, but if it gets far enough up that CO2 line and it hits your regulator, you're buying a new regulator.
You're buying a new regulator.
Those are not cheap. Now, there are a couple of different types of regulators that I highly recommend people who are force carbonating. I have a recommendation. So your standard primary regulator is what's connected to your tank. If you buy a manifold, all that does is it splits the pressure that you've got coming out of your primary regulator into however many kegs or valves are on that manifold. It's the least expensive way to go about having multiple kegs on tap, and they're all at the same pressure. I remember, scoffing at the price, but finally biting the bullet and saying, I'm just going to buy a secondary regulator. And again, they look like a lineup of primary regulators. And what it allows you to do is keep your primary set pretty high. I keep mine at about 50 PSI, and you run it into your secondary regulator, and you can individually control the PSI going to each keg or coming out of each of those valves. So I could be, carbonating one at 30 PSI and rolling it around, while another one is at, say, 8 PSI because I want it to be still or something. I'm just using an example here, and a couple other ones at 12 PSI. Secondary regulators, in my opinion, one of the most valuable things that you can buy if you are kegging your beer, because it gives you so much freedom to do different things with your beers and carbonate things differently. And again, they are like 3 times the price as a standard gas manifold, but I've never had one go bad on me. I've built probably 6 for friends and stuff, 6 or 7 keezers and kegerators, all of them with secondary regulators, because you want to be able to have control over that. That's just my opinion. Again, this adds to the cost, and that is a big drawback for a lot of people. With crank and shake, some of my experiences with this now. I have made beers that have come out perfectly fine using the crank and shake method. Again, I like to wait overnight at least before I start dipping into them. And when you nail it, you nail it. That beer's ready to drink the next day. You are shaking it up. So the most trub that you can leave behind in your fermentation vessel, the better, right? That's the case, in my opinion, for any method you're using. If you over carbonate, there are some problems that you can run into. Like I said, the Il Vesuvius beer, I still have, no joke, beer on the roof of my garage from a time I was crank and shaking, and I went to purge that keg, and I had pinlock kegs at the time, so no PRV. I had to just take a little screwdriver and depress the poppet, and you forget sometimes that you're shaking this keg, and it's got a ton of foam at the top, and you already filled the keg up, so there's not much headspace anyways. There are brown speckles all across the roof of my garage right now that serves as a daily reminder for me not to purge immediately after you crank and shake. Crank and shake. I'm struggling to say that. You can absolutely run into messy situations using this method.
Yeah. So, like we said, it's not one I use anymore, but I perfectly valid, right? It just know your system is really the main thing. And I get it. It's going to be, it's not sometimes, can be physically taxing. This could be a problem for some people. It's like literally, I don't want to bend over. My back's hurting. Yeah. I'm an old man. I don't want to hurt myself. Right. This is one of the more other things if you think about this technique, but again, perfectly valid. If you're in a rush, this is the way to go.
Oh yeah, if you're brewing for an event and that beer just took too long to ferment out, and you got a day to get it there, or you want to be able to taste it, a couple days ahead of time, crank and shake works perfectly fine. Just be careful. And again, if you over carbonate it, a little mess, whatever. What I got into the habit of doing was putting a paper towels. I would kind of cover the poppet while I'm depressing it, just in case anything squirted out. And problem solved. It's not a huge issue. But my biggest thing with this, like you said, it was the physical component. I didn't really like sitting out in the garage for 10 to 15 minutes to shake this thing. And, I kind of had this, for whether it's accurate or not, just kind of this concern of what kind of bad might be happening by agitating this beer so much.
Sure.
And so one day I'm talking with Tommy Caprellian of House of Pendragon Brewing, and I was asking him, how are you getting, we have a message group among a bunch of local brewers and stuff in town. So how are you getting these beers that you just texted us about, 2 days ago, and it's already on tap at the brewery? Like, it takes me 2 weeks to carbonate if I'm using the set it and forget it method. And he goes, well, we put it into a bright tank and we hit it with 35 PSI and a carb stone, right? For 12 hours or whatever. And then, once it gets to that carbonation level we like, it's ready to keg up and go to the brewery, or tap room. I thought, okay, so I'm going to try that on a homebrew scale. And this has become what we call the burst carbonation method. And it is the only way I carbonate beer nowadays. I don't use any other method really other than burst carbonation, which is sort of a hybrid of, your set it and forget it and your crank and shake. There's no agitation of the beer. You are just setting it and forgetting it, but usually only for about 12 to 18 hours as opposed to 2 weeks. I like this primarily because when I was using the crank and shake method, I was leaving it in that shaken keg in the kegerator or keezer overnight anyways. So could I come up with a method that didn't require me to shake the beer and this physically taxing process, which may or may not have some detrimental effect on the beer? Can I just hit the keg with a high pressure for a limited amount of time, reduce that pressure, and start drinking it then? And it works. In my opinion, it works perfectly well. It's quite easy using this method, or easier than crank and shake, in my opinion, to dial in the right carbonation level without overcarbonating. The only way I've ever overcarbonated using this method is that I forgot that we drink when we keg sometimes. I just forgot that I had a beer sitting at 50 psi in my fridge, and so I overcarbonated it, but I fixed it within about 12 hours, and it was back down ready to drink again. So basically, with this one, what you're doing is you're attaching the gas at high pressure. 30 to 50 psi is what I recommend. Of course, you can set it and forget it at 12 psi. So anywhere in between there and about 50 to 60 psi. Your kegs can handle much more than that, so it's not a concern there. Your gas line is rated to handle much higher pressures than that. So these are some concerns that people have emailed me about. You are not going to be busting gas lines if you're using the proper stuff or blowing up kegs or anything. And what you do is you hit the beer for anywhere between 12 and 48 hours, and then you come back. This is the big part here. You take the gas off. You release the pressure that is in the keg all the way down to zero if you want to be safe, but I go down to about what I know the sound of gas releasing out of the keg is about 12 psi, and then you reattach gas at your serving pressure, which for me again is about 14 psi these days. And then that beer's ready to go. I've messed around with a bunch of different burst carbonation schedules, and what I've found is that if you go on the lower end of 30 psi, it's going to take about 2 days for you to adequately carbonate an American style beer to what I would imagine is between about 2.5 and 2.8 volumes. But what I always do now is 50 psi for 12 to 15 hours, depending on the style and the strength of that beer. And then I reduce it down to 15 psi and I start serving it day after. So you're looking at less than 24 hours to go from non-carbonated beer in the fermentation vessel to a perfectly carbonated beer in the keg.
Yeah, this is one technique. I must have read it on Brewlosophy when I learned about it. That it makes it's perfect sense. Like we said, an extension of set and forget it. I've done this more recently when there was essentially not a rush to get the beer, but I had to hit a schedule, and you can imagine what the schedule was: exBEERience. So I would do this, just making sure. Again, the biggest thing is that you cannot forget about this. I would set an alarm on your phone. I would make a calendar reminder.
That's what I do.
Check on that because yes, you will obviously overcarbonate. To me, this is a great technique because the beer is going to be ready so much faster. Again, this assumes you don't need the time the beer sitting in the keg for some type of conditioning. That is a quote unquote negative, but it works really well. Again, just make sure you disconnect, purge, and reconnect all your gas. I will say, if you do run into the overcarbonation, a little tip I will recommend is you can wait, and that's perfectly fine to let the beer essentially degas the headspace, and then the gas comes out of solution into the headspace. The other thing you can do is, and this is again has the risk of putting some beer into your gas lines, but I do like it, is so get the gas out of the top of it, depressurize, but then put your liquid fitting on your gas line, and then actually bubble CO2 from the bottom. Now, you would think this is going to add CO2 to the beer. It's actually going to force the CO2 out much faster from the beer because it's agitated.
That's right.
So this could actually get you to your serving volume a little quicker than just waiting. So
The key in using that method, which I've never used, I've certainly heard about it and read about it, is you have to have some sort of a relief valve open when you're doing that, so that you are releasing that gas. Otherwise, you are adding more CO2 to the beer.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
It's kind of a similar concept of people who ferment in kegs who oxygenate by attaching oxygen straight to the liquid dip tube. works the same way. You just don't want to oxygenate, fermented beer, obviously, for obvious reasons. My experience with burst carbonation, like I said, has been, it's just such a beautiful approach to carbonating beer quickly. And it does, again, I've never gotten carbonic bite out of it. We've done experiments that show that it's no different than set it and forget it. We've done experiments comparing natural carbonation with burst carbonation or various forced carbonation methods, and they all seem to impart what we call carbonation. And, CO2 is CO2 is CO2 is the way I'm starting to look at it. I know people will argue that certain methods lead to a finer bubble. I don't know what that means. I think that's more a function of the OG of the beer, perhaps, or the ingredients that were used and the way that you perceive those bubbles on your palate. But all in all, I'm a burst carbonation fanatic. That is the approach that I use, and it's the approach I'm going to keep using. If you overcarbonate, again, just a couple of things to remember. If you overcarbonate a forced carbonated beer, it's very easy to fix. If you have a keg, just purge the gas, keep the gas from the regulator disconnected the entire time until it reaches your preferred carbonation level, and then you're good to go. You just attach it at gas back at serving pressure and start serving the beer. Natural carbonation, again, you can get away with fining, you can get away with cold crashing, all of that stuff. I just highly recommend figuring out ways to keep that beer from getting exposed to oxygen. But other than that, again, I'm a burst carbonation fan, but when I need to, I'll use natural carbonation methods.
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything we've talked about, or what your methods too. I think they're all, these are the ways to do it, right? The main thing about knowing these methods is picking the one that either works for your system, or picking the technique for the beer style, or how much money you want to spend, right? You can spend basically no money if you just want to use sugar, right? $1 or whatever. You can spend hundreds of dollars on fancy CO2 regulation systems and all these things. I mean, and really, those have only come to existence in the last few years, right? There's new techniques and new systems that make it easier to do it. But again, the upfront cost. So for me, I am a huge proponent of set and forget it. I'm becoming more of a burst carbonation person these days. And like I said, I'm going to bottle condition one beer a year. And I think the thing with the bottle conditioning is just remembering how much sugar to add, right? You can't just add willy-nilly amounts of sugar. So you have your measurements have to be really precise. You need to know how much beer you're carbonating, or how much volumes of beer you have, how many volumes of CO2 you want, and then look it up and run it. So there's pluses and minuses to all these techniques, but just use what works with your system and go for it.
Yeah, and honestly, whatever method you use to carbonate your beer, as long as your beer is bubbly, then that means it's working. So keep doing what you enjoy. But if you want to turn things around faster, consider some of these alternative methods. They work really well. So, well, Andy, that does bring us to the end of this episode on carbonation methods. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with? I think carbon dioxide is obviously toxic to us, but I love the flavor and the taste of it in beer. I'm currently enjoying a seltzer water that also has dissolved CO2 in it. So it's one of my favorite ingredients to beer. And it's the one I think, like we said earlier, it's like the least respect. So when you're thinking about these different ways of carbonating, really think about how much carbon dioxide you're adding and wonder if it needs less or more. And I think your beer is just going to be that much better if you take it that much more seriously. Dude, I'm right there with you. Carbonation is the fifth necessary ingredient in beer, in my opinion. All of these methods work equally as well with cider, with mead. I've had sparkling meads that are absolutely delicious. They work well with straight water. You're not going to use natural conditioning methods if you're making sparkling water. But yeah, I know people who do root beer and they do a little bit of fermentation to get the sparkle in their root beer. All of these methods are valid. They all work great. You just pick the one that works the best for you. So, well, don't forget to check out our new podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with real brewing experts to discuss fascinating research they have done on our favorite beverage. And remember, head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.